tried to find a way to say our relationship with China is important, but we've also got the Taiwan Relations Act, or something like you could imagine most politicians saying. So the answer was not a very good answer as far as I'm concerned. And so when you think about Taiwan's security environment, obviously the big looming challenge is and has been for always has been China. But I think uncertainty about exactly what the U.S. will be doing in Asia, whether, even let's just say that the Trump administration is kind of true to its word on its plans for strengthening the U.S. military position in Asia, but if that's not accompanied by kind of matching levels of emphasis on economic and diplomatic issues, I think you could still have a lot of problems. So the other important part of the security environment chapter here is what basically it says about China's military capabilities, and not just growing military capabilities, but how China is conducting more exercises and training at greater distances from China, and how they're operating around Taiwan. So the aircraft carrier that is in service with the PLA Navy now might not look like much of a sophisticated aircraft carrier compared to what the United States Navy has in service, but for countries along China's periphery, for Taiwan, it's potentially a pretty big deal. And to see some of the aircraft carrier activities and also some of the Chinese air activity around Taiwan, long-range bomber flights in particular, I think sort of tells you something about not just how much more capability China has, but how China can use it for kind of signaling or messaging purposes. And in particular, there have been a couple of instances in which, again, bearing in mind that when we started out talking about the mid-1990s, PLA Air Force didn't really operate over water so much at all. I mean, now they have sort of medium-range bombers that will fly out through the Miyako Strait. They've flown down around the east coast of Taiwan and then back over the Bashi Channel into China. And so that kind of air activity is obviously has a training purpose for the PLA Air Force, but I think is also intended to send kind of a deterrence or sort of coercive message to Taiwan. And so the QDR takes notice of those kinds of things, especially in an environment in which there's more tension in the cross-strait relationship. And after kind of talking about the security environment, the QDR goes on to sort of explain the Tsai administration's approach to Taiwan's national defense. It says that the defense strategy is now called Resolute Defense Multi-Domain Deterrence, and that's an evolution of what the kind of language that's been used to describe Taiwan's defense strategy over the years. It used to be, I think, a resolute defense, effective deterrence. So the basic idea here is, like, let's be honest, all militaries want to have some sort of bumper sticker for their defense strategy. They don't always amount to a whole lot. I mean, of course, you want to be able to deter and defend. In this case, though, I think there is actually something sort of new there, and that's the emphasis on multi-domain deterrence. And I think what that's getting at is that the Chinese military modernization has gone in the direction of placing a lot of emphasis on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and space operations, and offensive and defensive cyber warfare, and also on electronic warfare. And so I think for the QDR to talk about multi-domain deterrence is sort of a reflection of that challenge that they face on the other side of the strait, and also maybe sort of a reflection of how Taiwan can respond to it in some in innovative and asymmetric ways, potentially leveraging Taiwan's IT industry and maybe some of their strengths in some of those areas as well. So I actually think the multi-domain deterrence part of this is interesting, and probably more so than sort of the average bumper sticker for a defense strategy. Another important component of this overall approach that's reflected in the QDR is strengthening Taiwan's domestic defense industries. There's a sort of a security driver for that, obviously, because Taiwan is in a uniquely difficult position in terms of importing arms. Basically, the United States is at this point the only country that will consider major arms exports to Taiwan. Again, if you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, Taiwan had some other suppliers, but they've basically all been deterred from selling arms to Taiwan in the future because of fear of Chinese retaliation. So Taiwan's submarine force is very small, and Taiwan is looking to replace it, but The most modern couple of submarines that are part of that force, came from Europe, and that's not likely to happen again anytime soon. The Mirage fighter aircraft that are in the Taiwan Air Force's inventory, of course, are French, and I don't think France is going to be willing to risk that kind of level of retaliation from China again. So if you again at the sort of beginning of this period, there were not a huge number of options for Taiwan for purchasing arms from abroad, but there were several, and now that's basically down to the United States. So there's a security reason for wanting to be able to do more domestically. There are also important economic policy reasons. So for President Tsai, the defense industry focus is actually part of this broader economic policy of the 5+2 or 5 innovative industries, or ways that it's usually translated in English. And so the idea here, I think, is that this should be bolstering the shipbuilding, aviation, and information security industries for economic reasons as well as for national defense reasons. The QDR, as it has in past years, takes note of the kind of serious defense budget constraints that Taiwan faces, which again Karis mentioned in his introduction. And so just like in any other military, there are 3 major categories of expenditure: personnel, operations, and maintenance, which usually also covers training in most militaries, and then some kind of research, development, and acquisition category that covers procurement of new weapon systems, either domestically or by purchasing them from overseas. And both the DPP and before the DPP, the KMT, and the China administration before that have talked about having a 3% as a target for defense spending, and in most years not been able to meet it. And when you think about the kind of the high-quality military personnel are getting more expensive, so transitioning to a volunteer military makes them more expensive still. So that's an important budget category that you don't want to shortchange. It probably means, and it has meant, and I think probably will continue to mean, reducing the overall size. Or if you want to import them from somewhere else, you need to spend money on that. So this is very, very hard problem for a lot of reasons in terms of getting enough support for that domestically. I mean, I'll say that I don't think that I think sometimes we attach too much importance to the specific number of 3%. Right? It's a daunting challenge no matter what. At the end of the day, if Taiwan spent 2.9% really well and really effectively and had innovative solutions for dealing with the problems they face, I think that would be a whole lot better than spending 3.1% and just padding the budget with a bunch of things that get it up to 3% for political reasons. Right? So while there's a lot of focus on that, I think really we should think about it in terms of adequate defense resources and how they're spent. I mean, 3% is again is the target, but you could fall a little bit short of that and maybe be making better decisions about what you're spending. You could include things in the budget that probably don't belong in there to make it look like you're at 3%. You probably wouldn't really be solving your problem. But so that's another important feature of the QDR. Then they, of course, also talk about the manpower problems that come along with the attempt to move in the direction of a volunteer force. Having a smaller military makes that more affordable, because again, as individual recruiting and retaining the best people is expensive, and you're probably going to have fewer of them if you want to spend more money on them. But it creates challenges in terms of being able to respond to the kind of full range of contingencies that people in Taiwan have to worry about. And again, there's a kind of political reality that people probably have to acknowledge. And so I often think in terms of let's not beat up on Taiwan and say you really shouldn't do this or you should do this differently, but say okay, sometimes it's a democracy. They're going to make decisions based on their domestic politics, and then think about what's the best way to proceed from there. And here I would say it's probably to place greater emphasis on the role of their reserve forces. And that's something that actually Rand has done a study on recently that I was not a participant in, but it's an interesting report on where Taiwan might go with its reserves. So that just makes sense that if the size of the active duty military declines, then how would you kind of supplement that or compensate for that? Well, it would presumably be to have better trained, more highly capable, higher level of readiness for your reserve forces. So the QDR also talks about some of the other missions that Taiwan's military is responsible for. I think for us in the U.S. who focus on the Chinese military challenges, we mostly only think about that. But Of course, for Taiwan's armed forces, they also have to think about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and disaster preparedness within Taiwan. This QDR also mentions fishery protection because of the maritime disputes. And that is, of course, potentially something that can get beyond the scope of what any of the rival claimants' coast guards can handle, and hence can become a mission for their navies as well. And then the Taiwan's QDR also talks about cooperation with the United States and other partners. And so it's pretty much pretty complete consideration of the set of defense challenges that Taiwan faces under President Tsai. I think that kind of leads us in the direction of where Kara sort of wrapped up his remarks about some of these big-ticket weapon systems like F-35s, which the Taiwan's QDR, I don't believe they say F-35 specifically, but they describe the type of aircraft that F-35 is, and essentially say that's what Taiwan needs. And the submarine program also is one that would be difficult and very expensive. So when we kind of look at those, that brings us, I think, to the sort of implications for the U.S. and the decisions that the new administration will need to make about what kinds of arms to sell to Taiwan, how to work with Taiwan on sort of modernizing, continuing to modernize its armed forces and to refine its defense strategy to kind of better cope with the very daunting challenges it faces because of a much more capable, much more operationally capable Chinese military on the other side of the strait. We can get into that maybe a little bit more in the Q&A. I won't make a specific recommendation for whether we should or should not sell any particular piece of hardware as part of my remarks here, but I think it's important to to highlight one thing, which is that while the arms sales get the by far and away the most media attention, and sort of the most pundits talking about things like is the Trump administration delaying Taiwan arms sales because they're worried about impeding Chinese cooperation on North Korea and so on. These are all important questions, but so I guess I'd like to sort of wrap up by saying the U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation relationship is much broader than arms sales, a lot deeper and broader than arms sales. And so thinking about areas in which the U.S. and Taiwan can work together that will help Taiwan achieve some of its defense goals. Really most of those are not about arms sales. Okay, they're going to be about thinking about defense strategy, thinking about how to have more kind of asymmetric, cost-effective approaches to dealing to complicating the plans that Chinese military planners might develop. So my former Naval War College colleague Bill Murray wrote a lot about mobile air defense systems, mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, mines, other things that will make life vastly more difficult for a PLA officer who's charged with planning a campaign against Taiwan. So there is, I think, a lot to be done in terms of thinking about which capabilities are the most cost-effective ones to respond to different types of challenges. And of course, there's potentially there are things that the U.S. might be able to do in terms of sharing our knowledge and expertise about developing reserve forces that might be able to kind of complement the smaller active duty military for Taiwan. We certainly have a lot of expertise on recruitment and retention and lots of other areas that are not headline worthy, but I think might make a big difference in how Taiwan meets its defense challenges. And so those are all areas where I think, again, realistically, whether, I would think no matter who is in office, those are things that on the U.S. side we will continue to find very valuable components of our overall defense and security cooperation relationship with Taiwan. So I'll wrap up there. I know there are many people who know as much or more about different aspects of this than I do in the audience. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and hopefully getting a little bit more discussion going.
Okay, I'll take questions. John, you want to go first?
How do you interpret the one China policy? To my understanding, the United States should only have one China policy, which is based on the three communique and Taiwan Relation Act. And previous President Ma In-jo, I think he pretty much relies on the three communique. He locked Taiwan into the one China principle. Okay, so that means that Taiwan gets no way, has to be under the one China, under the Beijing. President Tsai is a little bit different. She insists in the the status quo, and status quo means that the should be